right. So today we're gonna go through proving who is Israel. Presentation of Ram Gadar Barbarian. Understanding how we say who we are from a historical perspective. So we want to kind of to get into that aspect. I'm going to start with the so-called Negroes because sometimes when we're bringing out that we're the Israelites, we want to make sure we have history to back our claims. So we're going to go into some biblical proof, right? Biblical proof. Let's go to Genesis 25:21 through 25. If you could begin reading that, sir.
The book of Genesis, chapter 25 and verse 21, and it reads, "And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived.
Keep going.
And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb."
So you need to make note of that. 2 nations. Keep going.
"And 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels."
That is key because 2 different groups come out of this woman, our foremother. Keep going.
"And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger.
Kind of keep going.
And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau."
Esau. All right. So what I want to do is jump to what a fact is, right? After we read that, because one of the things that you'll often get is that that's your interpretation of the scriptures. That's how you understand the scriptures, right? And we want to just kind of put some measure around what we understand our metric system to be. So a fact is the modern empirical sense of thing known to be true, a real state of things, what has really occurred or is actually the case, as distinguished from a statement or belief. That's so important because once you get into something known to be true in the real state of things, you no longer can say this is your belief because it is what it is as a fact as we know it. It's empirical, okay? Excuse me. So let's break this down. Let's dissect. What are the facts? Verse 21 says that Rebekah was the wife of Isaac and she was barren. When you go into that word barren, it is the Hebrew word agar, which is H6135, which means not able to produce children. So in the beginning, Rebekah was not able to conceive. So Isaac goes and they're finally able to conceive because of Isaac's prayer and the Lord's will, right? So you get into verse 22, it says that the children were breaking and bruising each other in the womb, right? This is where we get that it said that they struggled in the womb together, okay? So Rebecca, once she had become pregnant, couldn't understand why she was having so much issue with her pregnancy, as it was quite the war. In verse 23, you realize again that there were 2 different nations and 2 different people that had come from her womb, or that the Lord said would come from her womb, right? So let's ask a question real quick, right? Would God or Christ lie? Now, why do we bring this up right here? It's because whatever I'm going to bring out next, you have to put it in the context whether God would be lying. And if you think Christ is God, which, we don't hold that he's the Father, but that's neither here nor there. But if you hold that Christ is on that same level with the Father, you have to understand that neither one of these entities have the capacity to be lying, right? So bring out Numbers 23 and 19, and then 1 Peter 2:21 through 22.
Numbers chapter 23, verse 19 reads, God is not a man that he should lie.
He's not a what?
He's not a man that he should lie.
That he should lie. Keep going.
Neither the son of man that he should repent.
Mm-hmm.
Hath he said, and shall he not do it?
Mm-hmm.
Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good?
So when you're thinking about the Father, he is not an individual who is going to lie or repent in the sense that we understand repenting, like turning from our ways for going off. Bring that out in 1 Peter, if you would, sir.
Chapter 2 of 1 Peter in verse 21 says, For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin.
So lying would be a sin. Keep going.
Neither was guile found in his mouth.
So there was not any deception associated with Christ either, as it relates to when he was bringing it out. Okay. So let's keep going, right? So now that we understand that, let's break down what most people think. Most people think that the same person born to the same parents will be the same nation. This is true, except when the Lord says that this is not the case. And when you go and you dive into family tree, especially from a biblical perspective, many nations was born unto Abraham. So when the Lord says that you will have different nations, you will have different nations. So the question becomes, why don't people just adjust their perspective to what thus says the Lord? And we hold that it's because the understanding comes by keeping the law, statutes, and commandments. Psalms 119, 104, if you would, sir.
Verse 104 of Psalm 119 says, Through thy precepts I get understanding. Therefore, I hate every false way.
So you can't understand until you are living the precepts of the scripture. And that's just a reality, right? So now I want to get into the historical aspects. I'm going to start bringing up some maps and start going into some resources that's going to codify this information and bring us to our knowledge, right? All right, so the first map I'm going to show you is the mainland area of Africa of 1725, right? And when you're looking at this map, you see it's color coded, and those areas represent different regions within the continent of Africa. So you have Negro land, Upper and Lower Guyana, Kafira, Mandinga, Ethiopia, Nubia, Barbary, and Egypt, right? There's another map, 1747. This shows the Upper Guyana. This map shows the focus of the kingdom of Judah. If you see here on the map, I have it circled where the kingdom of Judah. If you go to the Library of Congress and search for Negro land being an accurate description of Africa, you will see in this region, if you zoom in, that it says the kingdom of Judah or Wida. Here are some of the names that Africa in that particular region was named in Judah. Okay, so you have Wida, Judah, Wida, Judah, and Wauda, which is Yoruba. So this shows other names to search for the same information. Sometimes it's spelled the French way, sometimes Spanish, and so it's just important so that you can have that understanding, right? When we talk about Africa, we have to understand why Jews are in Africa, right? Why is the nation of Israel, Southern Kingdom, some of the Northern Kingdom, but majority Southern Kingdom, why they're in Africa? And this is due to a migration. And what we have here is some of the places where they migrated to and had established within these areas. So you have Ethiopia, Somalia, Balad, El Sudan, North Africa, and Maghreb, Tanzania, Sato, and Presel, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mauritius. So when you're looking at their migration patterns, as you'll see from the information that's going to be brought out, is that they went through these places. And so our people are spread and scattered all throughout this continent, right? Let's look at some reasons on why they migrated. In Josephus' book, The Antiquity of Jews, he indicates that the temple was sacked or destroyed in 70 AD. This forced those who were not caught and could escape into North Africa and Central Africa to make that move, right? On page 108 of this book called The Golden Trade of the Moors, from very early times, the Jews have formed an important element in the population of Maghreb. Like other foreigners, they were regarded with contempt and were frequently treated with contumely. From the Maghreb, they spread, as already seen, into the oasis of the Sahara and into the Sudan. Maps were the products of a colony of Jews who originally noted as makers of clocks, astrobal, quadrants, and other instruments. So what that's indicating is that some aspects of Jews going into Africa dealt with trade, dealt with their line of work. In that same book on the next page, you have the persecution of the Jews by Ferdinand and Isabella spread from Spain into Africa and as already related through Sahara and Sudan. So what that's telling you is that they were being persecuted by the Spaniards, right? So they were in Africa or were going into Africa trying to flee the Spaniards, okay? Let's see what the historians say about Jews in Africa, okay? This guy here is Philo of Alexander. He's born between BC 1510 to CE 4550. And in his writings, he writes in his book on page 14, by Philo's time, the presence of Jews in Egypt was not something recent. Towards the 14th century BC, descendants of Abraham had sojourned there. The colony continued to grow in the last centuries before our era. Philo reports that in his time, there were 1 million Jews in Egypt and 100,000 in Alexandria. And if you know that Alexandria is still in the part of Africa, okay? Here's the actual statement from Philo himself, right? It says, knowing that a city had two classes of inhabitants, our own nation and the people of the country, and that the whole of Egypt was inhabited in the same manner, and that the Jews who inhabited Alexandria and the rest of the country from Katabarmos on the side of Libya to the boundaries of Ethiopia were not less than 1 million of men, and that the attempts which were being made were directed against the whole nation. Okay, so Philo was a guy who was trying to marry Greek and Israelite culture together. So as a historian, this is how he brought that information out. So look at another historian, Tacitus, lived shortly after Philo, between AD 56 to CE 120. In Tacitus' book, The Histories, Volume 2, Book 5, page 302, he says, while there are many who think Jews and Ethiopians stopped, the Phoenicians driven to migrate their fear and dislike of King Cephas, right? So what he's saying in this regard is that the Jews, they thought the Jews were Ethiopian stock because they looked like each other, you know, both being of the melanated, right? So Ethiopians and Phoenicians looked black to them. Let's look at another historian. This is Flavius Josephus from AD 37 to CE 100. In the book of the Antiquity of the Jews, he writes in book 6, from the great extremity to which Jews were reduced to taking of Jerusalem by Titus, in subpart 9, the number of the captives and of those that perished in the siege, on page 343, paragraph 2, over which Caesar set one of his free men, as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which last was to determine everyone's fate according to his merits. So Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, and who were impeached one by another. But of the young men, he chose the tallest and most beautiful, and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he but uh, he put them into bonds and sent them into the Egyptian mines. So what that first paragraph is saying, some were captured, and some were reserved, and then those who were retained as slaves, and we're talking about the Jewish people here, they were sent into Egypt. So it's no wonder. Here's another reason why Jews would be in Egypt, because during the destruction of the temple, some were captured and sent to the Egyptian mines, right? In paragraph 3, he says, now the number of those that were carried away captive during the whole war collected to be 97,000. So in Philo is saying that it was at least 1 million there. And then in this time period, they're saying that there is at least 97,000 that was captured. That's a lot of people, right? Hold that 1 second, because I have another portion of that book that I wanted to read from Josephus that compounds what I'm saying about the Jews being in Africa. Give me 1 second. All right, here we go. So in paragraph 3, if you carry on, it says, after that 97,000, it says, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation, but not belonging to the city itself, right? So they're saying that, okay, there were people who were in Jerusalem that were of the nation, but not belonging to that city. So that's some portions of Northern Kingdom there, right? For there were come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at very first occasioned so great a straitness among them that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly. Right? It says, so these high priests, upon the coming of the feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour till the 11th, was so a company not less than 10 belong to every sacrifice, and many of us are 20 in a company. Found the number of sacrifices was 256,500, which from the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together amounts to 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy. So Josephus is recording that now you're up to 2 million people that's in Africa, right? Let's keep going. See what else we have. Let's see what the scholars say about Jews in Africa and how that worked out. So this guy here, Samuel G. Morton, who was born on January 26, 1799, and he died in May of 1851, was considered an American physician and a natural scientist. And he wrote this book called Crania Egyptia, or the observations of Egyptian ethnography derived from anatomy, history, and monuments. In his book on page 59, this is what he records. Of Negro slavery, in particular, the paintings and sculptures gives abundant illustration. Black people are designated as natives of the foreign land of Kush, are generally represented on the Egyptian monuments as captives or bearers of tribute to pharaohs. And the attendant circumstances of this inhumane traffic appear to have been much the same in ancient as in the modern times. So he compared the Negro schools in Egypt to the Negro schools in America and found that they were the same. That was what he was doing over in Africa, right? And so what he was saying it was these people who were considered to be on the monuments bearing this tribute hold the same social position that in his time, and if we go back a slide, you'll see his time is during slavery within America, 1799 to 1851, because slavery had not been abolished in America until 1865. So this is why he's making that comparison, that they were the same in ancient as in modern times. So there's another resource. Let's continue to see what the scholars say. This here is the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, Origins, Experiences, and Culture, published in 2008. And here's what they say. Some accounts place West African Jewish communities in the Ondo forest of Dahomey, south of Timbuktu. In the 1930s, these groups still maintained a Torah scroll written in Aramaic that had been burned into parchment with a hot iron instead of ink so that it could not be changed. Because colonizers are famous for destruction, like they did in Alexandria and burned the library of the Jews. And they are good for trying to get you to come into their customs and ways. There's another book. This here is The Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfit. On page 108, Divine Geography and Israelite Identities, he writes, but when Mohammedanism overspread northern Africa, destroying by fire and sword all those of another religion, the Israelite descendants of the inhabitants occupying the central portion of Africa passed forward, seeking shelter to the south and west, a part, namely those from the east central crossing the Bainoun or Joliba branch of Niger, descended gradually southward and became intermingled with original inhabitants. So you not only have the Spaniards who sent Jews into Africa, it was also the Romans, according to Josephus, who sent Jews into Africa from the destruction. Before then, you had Philo, who would have been a part of the Grecians. He would have been a Jew, but he would have been in the time frame that the Grecians were starting to die out and the Romans were starting to come into power. And now what you have here is Ishmael, the Mohammedans, coming into play, right? So you got at least 4 different nations now that's taken a part of the spoils of Israel, right? As said in 2nd Maccabees. So let's look at another source. Jews and the Blacks in the early and modern world. This is by Jonathan Schwartz, page 179 to 182. He quotes this. William Breton of 1604 to 1661, the English parliamentarian, soldier, and writer, happened to visit a Sephardic synagogue in Amsterdam, where he commented that the Jews were very dark-skinned and lascivious. They were most black and insatiable given unto women. I would say that he made a fair assessment about the Jews, okay? Let's keep going. What the scholars record. This book is called A New Voyage to Italy, with curious observations on several countries. It's volume 2 by Maximilian Mission, right? And Key records this: Francis Maximilian in 1714, the French writer and traveler, confirms that the general supposition was that the Jews were Black when he noted that all Jews were Black, although only Portuguese Jews started off Black. "'Tis also a vulgar error," he wrote, "that the Jews are all Black, for this is only true of the Portuguese, who marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves, and consequently the swarthiness of their complexion is entailed up on their whole." So one of the things that you will notice here is other aspects of the nation starting to come into the history. So you have your Indian descent, which furthermore into the Hispanic descent that you will see starting to surface a little bit. And this is why you said some of them are not all Black, because as it's recorded, being dark skinned is one thing, but with time and being a part of different areas, you have the intermixing, and then you have, according to science, the gene pool that is taking on dominant and recessive traits as it relates to melanin within our bodies. Okay. Let's continue with what the scholars say. In this book, The Golden Trade of the Moors by Edward William Boville, the Tuareg and other peoples of the Sahara, on page 50. See what he has to say. In modern times, the Maghreb has contained a population of up to 500,000 Jews, and it is clear that a Jewish population has been settled in North Africa for many centuries. It is possible that some Jews accompanied the first Phoenician settlers at the beginning of the first millennium BC, but the first true wave of Jewish immigrants to North Africa seems to have arrived late in the 6th century before Christ in Carnation. Sir, if you would please get Matthew 27:32.
The book of Matthew, chapter 27, and verse 32 reads, "And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name.
Mm-hmm.
Him they compelled to bear his cross."
Okay. If you would also pull Acts chapter 2, and won't you go to start at verse 8.
Acts chapter 2, verse 8 reads, "And how hear we every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born, Parthians and Medes and Elamites, and the dwellers in Mesopotamia, and in Judea,
Mm-hmm.
and in Cappadocia, in Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia, and Pamphylia, in Egypt, and the rest of the parts of Libya about Cyrene,
Mm-hmm.
and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes."
So as you see, this history is matching up because they're saying that there were people in Cyrene. This is the same place, Carnatia, right here. So it's the same place. It says in 115 AD on the same page that there was a major Jewish revolt against the Roman rule in Carnatia. After the revolt had been suppressed, many Jews fled westward. Some of them probably established themselves in the oasis of the northern Sahara, where their presence was recorded in medieval times. Some scholars have suggested that after the Carnation revolt, a great wave of Jewish immigrants crossed Sahara and settled into West Africa. And this is important here because now you're starting to see how that migration worked through the narratives of those who were recording history, right? So again, we covered Philo, who said there was millions of people in Africa who had come down. We covered aspects to show that the Spaniards was persecuting. We showed that Ishmael and the Mohammeds were persecuting. And we also showed that the Romans were persecuting. And here's another example of the Romans in their persecution in 115 AD. So they're steady persecuting because Roman rule covered up to a good portion of northern Africa. So they had to continually go down, right? Let's see what the rest of the scholars say. In this book called Race and History, an Ethnological Introduction to History, Professor E. Pitter, on page 337, says, whatever the real explanation of the Falasha origin may be, this much is certain, that even anthropologists unequivocally classify them as Jews. Now, the Falashas are in Africa, in the continent of Africa, right? So here is a picture of some of the tribes that we have going about. And so these different tribes in Africa at this point had taken on different names, right? But in these places is where our migration gets to. And you start seeing the resemblance of these people knowing or having a very direct connection to Hebrew Israelites, right? So if you look here, you see say like the Ashanti, you'll see the Ewe, you'll see the Fontes, you see the Yoruba, you see the Igbo, you see the Fulani, you see, so a good portion of all of these people here had many Southern Kingdom people there and had taken on that custom, but they retained as best as they could, being away from the temple and in particular the whole of the nation, their identity as so much as to be identified still as Jews in these regions, right? Let me zoom back out for a second. All right. So let's look at some more scholars. This guy here, Joseph J. Williams, he wrote this book called Hebrewism of West Africa, published in 1930 on page 36. Speaking of Ashanti region, this Negro immigration was in part a westerly drift from Chad Now area and in part a direct southward movement from the western Sudan and Sahara borders, forced by the expansion in the Sahara region of the Caspian. If you don't know what Caspian, that is the Caucasus people, white people in short, who have poured into northern Africa since very early times, right? Let's look at another scholar. Well, this actually is a missionary eyewitness. So as we transition from what the historians spoke about, and then we went into what the scholars spoke about, let's look at some of what the missionaries eyewitnesses record. This is John Lytton Wilson, 1809 to 1886, in a book called Western Africa, Its History, Condition, and Prospects, published in 1856 on page 220, writes, in Guyana, before Christianity had an opportunity to make an impact upon the culture and religion of the region, there are many obvious traces of Judaism, both in northern and southern Guyana. The practice of Judaism is prominently developed, some of the leading features of which are circumcision, the division of tribes into separate families, and very frequently into number 12, blood sacrifices with the sprinkling of blood upon altars and doorposts, and other customs classified of Israelite origin. Now that's pretty interesting because this, if I can go back for a second, is over here. Ashanti was right here. So that's what I was saying. This region, we know for certain, was heavily populated with Jews, right? So let's look at another source, right? Missionary eyewitness records. Mungo Park travels in the interior districts of Africa, published in 1810 on page 116. See what he writes. In Guyana, he observed the legal whipping among the Tessie people in the Kasab region. The number of stripes was precisely the same as required by the Mosaic law, 40 save one. He also notes that these people were neither Christian nor Muslim at that time. If you could, sir, pull Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 3. We just want to see if what the record of the scripture bears to what he seen. Where would they have gotten this understanding to go here?
It's the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 1, and it reads, if there be a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. Verse 2, and it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. Verse 3, 40 stripes he may give him, and not exceed, lest if he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee.
So there we have where that number comes from. Pull up 2 Corinthians 11 and 24.
2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24 reads, of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one.
So now we understand that these writers in the scriptures are showing that history of what went on in that day, and the historians or the eyewitness missionaries are saying that this same custom is still going on. Okay, let's see another source here. This here is Pierre Bertrand Boucher, from 1835 to 1903. He was a French historian, and he wrote this book called La Côte des Esclaves et le Dahomey, published in 1885, right? This is what he writes about Dahomey, which is a portion in which the kingdom of Judah was found or was noted on the maps earlier. In his book, he referenced to an earlier map by Jean d'Anville, which indicates that the country around Negros formerly inhabited by Jews. He says that this view was found still earlier in the writings of Idris, an Arab scholar and a geographer of the 12th century. He adds, one find among the blacks many Jewish customs. So in one source, you get a French historian, and then you get an Arab scholar. They're both saying the same thing, that these people around here are black, All right, let's look at some more. This is Elise Reclus, 1830 to 1905, right? Now, he's a French geographer. So I've taken you through what historians have said. I've taken you through what scholars have said. I've taken you through what the missionaries have said. Let's see what the science person says or the geographer says, right? In this book called The Earth and Its Inhabitants, The Universal Geography of West Africa, Volume 7, published in 1850, this is what he writes on page 267 about Dahomey. East of the Great Pop begins the Dahomey territory, guarded by the important town of Gloweda, known to Europeans by the various names of Fida, Havida, Wida. The old writers called it Judah, and its inhabitants were said to be Jews, while the neighboring river Allah, whose real name is Afra, became the Euphrates. During the flourishing days of the slave trade, from 16 to 18,000 were annually transported from Ajuda, as the Portuguese called this place, which at that time had a portion of 35,000. So again, you start to see other aspects of the nation coming out, right? So they're being transported from Africa now into the Portuguese, right? Up there toward where the Spaniards are, okay? Spain area, right? So let's keep going. Let's see what another science man may say. John Ogilvy, he was a Scottish cartographer from 1600 to 1676. And he wrote this book called Africa, being an accurate description of the regions of Egypt, Barbary, Libya, and Beldugaria, the land of the Negroes, Guinea, Ethiopia, and Abilities, published in 1850. Actually, it's not published in 1850. This is not supposed to be on there. But disregard this last portion of the published date. All right, but this is what he says on page 34. Many Jews also are scattered over this region, some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed inhabiting both sides of the river Niger. Others are Asian strangers who fled thither from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian, or from Judea, wasted and depopulated by the Romans, Persians, Scythians, and Christians, or else such as came out of Europe whence they were banished. Out of some parts of Italy in the year of 1342, out of Spain, 1462, out of Low Countries in 1350, out of France, 1403, out of England, 1422. These all differ in habit and are divided into several tribes having no dominion, though both wealthy and numerous, but despised of all nations, and so abominated by the Turks that they are not admitted into the Mohammedans unless they first baptized, and then no other wise made use of them than to receive their customs and gather in their taxes. Now, so when it says Asian strangers, that's not talking about Moab. That's talking about still inhabiting the land of Israel, and that is called an Asian land or a Afro-Asian land because the continent falls on both, right? So that's something to be noted. If you would, sir, could you read Second Maccabees? I want to pull this out, right? 1 second here. Second Maccabees real quick. And let's go to Second Maccabees chapter 2, and let's look at, started at verse 9. Actually, start at verse 7. Salaki, verse 6. So you're going to read 6 through 10.
Second Maccabees chapter 2, verse number 6 reads, and some of those that followed him came to mark the way.
Salakia. First Maccabees chapter 2, 6 through 10.
It's the book of First Maccabees chapter 2, verse number 6 reads, and when he saw the blasphemies that were committed in Judah and Jerusalem, verse 7 says, he said, woe is me, wherefore I was born to see this misery of my people and of the holy city, and to dwell there when it was delivered into the hand of the enemy, and the sanctuary into the hand of strangers. Her temple is become as a man without glory. Verse 9. Verse 9 says, her glorious vessels are carried away into captivity. Her infants are slain in the streets, her young men with the sword of the enemy. Verse 10, what nation hath not had a part in her kingdom and gotten of her spoils?
So what you see here is that this eyewitness account from this Scottish cartographer, what he's identifying is that everyone is partaking in that. You see Romans, Persians, Scythians, the Christians, Vespasian, that's a Roman. They're coming out of Europe. They're in Italy. They was in Spain. They was in Low Countries. They was in France. They was in England. So that's something that you got to always remember is that we've been fighting this battle a long time, and the history is matching up with the scriptures. Let's continue reading, right? So this guy, who was another missionary, his guy name was G.T. Basin, born 1873 to 1944. He was an archdeacon of the Niger, and he wrote this book called Among the Igbos of Nigeria, Travelers, Explorers, and Pioneers, published in 1921. And on page 31, this is what he writes about Nigeria. There are certain customs which point to the Levitic Israelite influence at a more or less remote time. This is suggested by the underlying ideals concerning sacrifice and in the practice of circumcision. The language also bears several interesting parallels with Hebrew idioms. Among the Igbo, there is a distinct recognition of a supreme being, beneficent in character, who is above every other spirit, good or evil. He is believed to control all things in heaven and on earth and dispenses reward and punishments according to merit. So there you have someone who's breaking down another portion of Africa and saying that these people are holding customs of Israelites. Yeah, let's keep reading. You have this guy that Stephen Jacobs, who wrote this book, The Hebrew Heritage of Black Africa, 1976. It was published. On page 52 and 53, he says, John Clark, who was the missionary, a British missionary, writes in 1848 that Ollendorff, an earlier traveler in the region previously called the French Equatorial Africa, and now known as part as the Central African Republic. So we're talking about Cameroon, Gabon, Angola, what's that other portion? All up in this central area right there. Speaks of Black Jews being in this part of Africa. There's another missionary, Father Giuseppe Sayati, spent several years at the Catholic Catholic Mission in Kenya. So now we're in Kenya. In a manuscript written in September of 1932, he says, it can be easily concluded that the Agakyo have had some contact with the Hebrews after their departure from Egypt. He then explains Leviticus 28, 1 through 23 is rigorous law for the Agikoyo. Exodus 21, 35, 36 is scripturally observed. The same he says of Exodus 22, 10, 13, 18, and 22. Exodus 23 and 4, 19, 22, which are fully observed precisely as written. Leviticus 19, 14, 26, 32, 33 are also laws of the tribes. Now, this is interesting because he's saying that they observed them. Sir, if you would get Psalms 147.
This is book of Psalm, chapter 147, verse 19, and it reads, He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. Verse 20, he hath not dealt so with any nation, and as for his judgments, they, Salakia, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise ye the Lord.
So what we have here is these Jews in Africa observing law, which the law, according to Christ, in Psalm says that it was only given unto Jacob, and his words, his statutes unto Israel. So that's why they would be observing it in Kenya, right? That's the only way they would know, right? So let's continue to see what scholars record, right? So we've talked about, as a recap, we've talked about what the historians say. We've also identified what the scholars say about what the historians say. We've went through and talked about what the missionaries, the eyewitness accounts say. We've even went into what the science personnel, both the cartographers and geographers, was saying, what they recorded. Now we're going to get into making it across the waters of the Atlantic in the slave trade, and now we're here in the Americas. So now we've left Africa, we've made it to Americas, and let's see where they have docked their ships. Okay. This is a book called French Colonial Louisiana and the Atlantic World by Bradley G. Bunn on page 279. And he says, it was in this region between Cape Monte and Cape Montserrat that Sir Herpin, captain of the first slave ship to arrive in Louisiana, was supposed to drop anchor to buy rice and cultivators before going to Judah or Wauda, where he had to trade for additional human cargo and corn to feed. So what this particular scholar is identifying is that this French ship is headed to pick up slaves, and they're headed to Louisiana. Let's read another source. This is Marc Antoine Caliat in the Companies of Indies and Louisiana Trade in the French Atlantic World. It's by Aaron Grinwald. On page 74, it says, from 1723 to 1725, when the company had sent out a total of 63 ships, 26 to Senegambia, 17 to Guinea, 14 to Aouda, and 6 to Angola, to Africa's west coast at an average of 21 per year. Because if you recall earlier what we read about the port of Judah, it was getting at least 18,000, 16 to 18,000 people shipped from there to Portugal alone, to the Portuguese alone. And now these French have got involved in the trade, and now they are sending them to their respective locations to where they hold authority. Here's another one. Louisiana and the Gulf South Frontier from 1500 to 1821 by F. Todd Smith. The Company of the Indies maintained several trading posts on the west coast of Africa, including Fort St. Louis and Gorée near the Senegal River, as well as one farther south at Judah, the Bight of Benin. The first slave ship, La Aureille, arrived in Louisiana in the spring of 1719, carrying a cargo of 200 slaves who had been obtained at Judah. So now, not only do you have the migration from the landmass of Israel into the continent of Africa, from Africa into the central and west coast, and then some aspects of the south too. Now we're moving from the west coast, being picked up on ships, getting migrated or getting carried as prisoner into the Americas, right? And this ship here docks at the port in Louisiana and drops off 200 enslaved of our ancestors, right? Let's keep reading. Over the course of the next 4 years, 9 ships transported another 1,900 slaves to the Gulf Coast, 1,100 from Judah, 500 from Senegambia, 300 who had been obtained at Cabina in the Portuguese-controlled Angola. So now you got not just that 200, but you got an additional 1,100 people from that area. And we've already discussed that Senegambia and its respective territories held many of the Jews in Africa as they were in migration from persecution of the Spaniards, the Mohammedans, the Romans, the Grecians, and even the Africans themselves. Okay, let's continue to see what the scholars say about this. In a book called Creole New Orleans, Race and Americanization by Arnold R. Hirsch and Joseph Lawson, on page 69 and 70, it says, the French had little hope of trading in Angola except with great difficulty. Although the Company of the Indies had a trading post at Judah, the Gulf of Benin, there it competed with all nations of Europe, right? If you will, sir, Get me Joel chapter 3. I'm gonna go into that real quick. Watch this. And verse 6.
All right, it's the book of Joel, chapter 3, verse number 6, and it reads, "The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians."
Unto the Grecians. Okay, keep wait. Hold on. Slack it 1 second. Keep going on that.
"That ye might remove them far from their border."
So as you can see, all nations of Europe, well, the Grecians would be a part of that, right? Removing them far from their borders, which have been in Israel. Now you're in Africa. Now you're in Spain, France, and even the Americas, right? So if you look at this chart that I have here on the screen, you'll see a total that had come from Judah was about 1749 enslaved people had come from Judah. You got 200, almost 300 that come from Angola, which is Combinant. And then you have the Senegal Goree, you had 3,900 come from that area. And all three areas, respectively, had Southern Kingdom Israelites there. So you had Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Okay, now let's see that we've now talked about the historians, we've talked about the scholars, talked about the missionaries, we've talked about the scientists. Now let's see what the enslaved have to say. This is a book by Charles Pennington, born in 1807, died in 1870. So he died shortly after slavery was abolished over here. In a book called A Textbook of the Origin and History, etc., of Colored People in 1841, he writes, a stronger case is still to be found in the fact that the descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea to the coast of Africa are Black. Can't get around that. Let's see. Aluada. I always have trouble with this guy's name. How you say it, sir?
Your guess is as good as mine. Olaudah, perhaps.
Olaudah.
Equiano.
Equiano. I always have trouble with his name. Olaudah, born in 1745 to 1797. He writes a narrative on himself and his time in slavery. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. He was brought to Virginia. All right. So we talked that when we say the port of Louisiana, we're saying that these people not only inhabited Louisiana, but that's Mississippi, that's Georgia, that's going to be Alabama. Then you had ships docking at Florida, and now you see that there were ships still docking at Virginia, up in still the South considered. So this is what he writes. The interesting narrative, he writes, we practiced circumcision like the Jews, made offerings and feast on the occasion in the same manner as they did. Like them also, our children were named from some event, some circumstance, or fancy foreboding at the time of their birth. I was named Olaudah, which in our language signifies vicissitude or fortune also. One favored and having a loud voice and well spoken. He says, I have before remarked that the natives of this part of Africa are extremely cleanly. The necessary habit of decency was with us a part of religion, and therefore we had many purifications and washings. Indeed, almost as many and used on the same occasion. If my recollection does not fail me as the Jews, those that touched the dead at any time were obliged to wash and purify themselves before they could enter a dwelling house. Every woman, too, at certain times was forbidden to come into a dwelling house or touch any person or anything we ate. So that goes to show you, again, that lines up with the Levitical laws, the Deuteronomy, that lines up with everything that's in from Genesis up until Deuteronomy and aspects of the Psalms, right? So what we have to remember is that these are the sources, and these sources are established that without a shadow of doubt that we are the Israelites the Bible speaks of. There's no way around that. We've went through historians. As a matter of fact, I would count how many sources. Let me go back just to see how many we got in here. If you start with the maps, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. If you could, sir, can you find me a matter is established? Give me that in, let's go to Matthew. It's Matthew 18.
It is the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verse 16 reads, "But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word, 2 or 3 witnesses, every word."
So if we made it to 27 witnesses,
we are beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay, all right. Keep going.
That in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established.
Go to Deuteronomy 19:15.
It's the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 19, verse 15 says, book of Deuteronomy, chapter 19, verse 15 says, "One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity, for Salak, or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth, at the mouth of 2 witnesses, or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established."
So this is just covering the so-called Negroes. And this is part 1. Part 2 is going to be proving Israel, the so-called Native Indians. From that portion, we're going to dive into the Native Indians being taken away as recorded in the Book of Kings, and brought to a land that they know not. And then we're going to get into how from the Native Indians into the Hispanics, which is a part of the Indian group. So with that being said, shalom, and Yahweh B'Ashem Yahshabrakatah.
Yahweh B'Ashem Yahshabrakatah.